In a concrete chamber 4 floors beneath the cooling towers, a Soviet engineer sits before a bank of dials and needles. The air tastes of metal and something else, something that hasn't yet acquired a name. Somewhere above, it is April 26, 1986, 1:23 in the morning. The fluorescent hum overhead is the only sound. His hand hovers over a clipboard. The number on his gauge, impossible number, blinks back at him. In 30 seconds, he will not record it. In 3 hours, the city will still be asleep. In 2 days, no one will believe him. And what he knows in this moment will become the architecture of a lie so vast that even the truth, when it finally emerged, would carry the weight of something forbidden. This is what silence does. Not the silence of not knowing, but the silence of knowing too much and choosing architecture over voice. This is the story of how an entire system learned to see catastrophe and look away, and how, once you understand the mechanism, you begin to recognize it everywhere. Now, let us return to the beginning. If histories buried within archives and silence interest you, stories about how power actually functions, the kind that rarely make it into official records, consider subscribing. What follows is one such story. The Soviet Union in the spring of 1986 was a machine built on a single principle. Information flows upward, but only certain information. Orders flow downward, but only certain orders. Everything else, the gaps, the contradictions, the impossible numbers on the dials, these are absorbed into a kind of gray space where they neither exist nor fail to exist. They are managed. This is what the system called pragmatism. The plant at Chernobyl was not an exception to this rule. It was the rule in its purest expression. The men who worked there understood their place in the hierarchy without ever needing to be told. The reactor operators understood that their primary duty was not safety, it was continuity. The supervisors understood that their value was measured not in lives saved, but in quotas met. The engineers understood that uncertainty was a luxury that threatened production. The administrators in Kiev understood that any disruption to the narrative of progress would ripple upward in ways that would diminish them personally. And the scientists understood that questions asked too loudly would be heard as criticism of those who had made the earlier decisions. This was not a system that concealed malice. It concealed something far more dangerous: the distribution of small, moral compromises across hundreds of people, each one convinced that they alone were not responsible. And they were right. The responsibility was distributed in such a way that no individual could carry its full weight. This was the design. The reactor itself was RBMK 1000, a design that the Soviet nuclear establishment had invested enormous prestige in defending. For years, the official line had been repeated. This reactor was foolproof. Soviet engineering had solved the problems that plagued Western designs. The superiority was not merely technical, it was ideological. It was written into the speeches, into the training materials, into the expectations of every man who had devoted his career to proving it true. To doubt the reactor was to doubt the system. To question its safety was to question whether you yourself belonged in the system. By 1986, the RBMK 1000 at Chernobyl had become more than a machine. It had become a statement, a proof, a monument to the rightness of the socialist project. When safety concerns were raised, and they were raised in memos and in quiet conversations, they were framed as threats to something larger than the reactor itself. To allow the reactor to be uncertain was to allow uncertainty to spread through the entire structure of belief that held the Soviet Union together. The test that was scheduled for April 25, 1986, was meant to demonstrate the reactor's capabilities during a controlled power down. The test itself seemed routine. On paper, It was designed to show that even if the main pumps failed, the reactor's own momentum could sustain circulation long enough for emergency systems to engage. It was a test of redundancy, a test of preparation. What no one wrote down, what could not be written down, was that the reactor was operating at a state of readiness that the designers themselves had never fully verified. The men in the control room that night were not saboteurs. They were not reckless. They were experienced operators, following procedures that had been approved by people above them, who in turn were following procedures approved by people above them, who in turn were following directives issued by people who would never be in a room where the consequences of those directives could be felt. This is the structure that makes catastrophe possible. Not evil, not incompetence, but a chain so long and a system so opaque that responsibility becomes anonymous. At 1:23 in the morning on April 26th, the reactor's thermal power suddenly spiked. The water in the core began to boil uncontrollably. The steam pressure increased. The emergency cooling system did not engage as expected. The design flaw, present in the RBMK 1000 since the beginning, became visible in real time. In those final moments before the explosion, the operators in the control room understood what was happening. They could see it in the dials. They could feel it in the way the building had begun to sound different. Some of them tried to activate emergency protocols, but the protocols themselves were designed by a system that had never admitted the possibility of what was now occurring. The explosion that followed was not one event. It was the failure of every assumption upon which the system had been built. The core was exposed. Radioactive material, an amount sufficient to poison an entire region for generations, began its rise into the atmosphere. But even in this moment, even as the catastrophe became physical and undeniable, the system's primary instinct was not to warn. It was to contain. Not the radiation, the information. Within hours of the explosion, a decision was made at the highest levels of the Soviet government. The decision was not whether to tell the truth. It was how to manage the truth so that it would do the least damage to the structure that had concealed it. Officials in Moscow received briefings that included accurate measurements of the radiation. They understood the severity. The evacuation began, not because the truth had been declared, but because at certain levels of the government, the truth was too obvious to deny in private. Yet publicly, the silence held. The people of Pripyat woke on April 26 to a day like any other. No sirens, no announcements, no official word that anything had changed. Children went to school. Workers reported to their jobs. Some were sent to the plant itself, into the contaminated zone, because no official had authorized them to stay away. The mothers of Pripyat moved through their days in an expanding circle of uncertainty. Something was wrong. But what could you do with an intuition that contradicted every official statement? What could you do with a fear that no authority would acknowledge? By evening, Soviet officials were in contact with the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. The conversations were careful. The numbers provided were understated. The severity was minimized. But the world would learn the truth eventually. The question was not whether it could be hidden forever. The question was whether it could be hidden long enough for the narrative to be shaped by those in power rather than those who were suffering it. Here is where the psychology of the system becomes visible. The officials who made these choices were not monsters debating cruelty in a dark room. They were men attending meetings, reading reports, making phone calls. Each one of them was operating within a logic that had been constructed long before they arrived. The logic said that the stability of the system was more important than the individual lives at risk. The logic said that transparency would create panic, which would create chaos, which would threaten the system itself. And if the system itself was threatened, then the individual lives were threatened in a much larger way. But this logic, this choice to preserve the system over protecting its people, it did not begin or end with the Soviet Union. Look at any institution where the top never feels the consequences of decisions made from above. Look at hierarchies where dangerous truths circulate in private memos while public statements maintain a fiction. The logic is always the same. Transparency creates panic, panic creates chaos, and chaos threatens the structure that gives those in power their meaning. Once you recognize this pattern, you see it everywhere. The evacuation of Pripyat did not begin officially until late on April 27th. By then, families had already begun to understand that something catastrophic had occurred. But they learned this not from any official source. They learned it from the absence of official sources, from the way that authorized channels had begun to stutter and contradict themselves, from the fact that the most dangerous place on Earth was being treated at the level of public communication as a routine industrial incident. The buses that came to evacuate Pripyat came without explanation. Those who asked questions were told only to bring documents and one bag. Some families tried to bring photographs, letters, the small archives of their lives. They were told to leave them. The houses would be waiting. They would return in a few days. No one who lived in that moment believed this, but everyone in authority had incentive to speak it, and so it was spoken. The evacuation itself became a performance of normalcy, maintained even as normalcy was ending. In the days after the explosion, Soviet officials made a series of public statements. The first, the reactor had sustained some damage, but the situation was under control. The second, a small number of people had been injured. The third, heroic measures were being taken to contain the situation. Each statement contained just enough truth to maintain plausibility, and just enough omission to control the narrative. The strategy was not to deny the disaster, it was to reframe it. The men working in the reactor, the ones who received lethal doses of radiation trying to reach the core, they understood what was happening. They knew they were dying. But even in their sacrifice, the system tried to maintain control of the story. The official narratives would later speak of their heroism, their willingness to die for the motherland. And this was not untrue, but it was a framing designed to transform a tragedy born of systemic failure into an opportunity to demonstrate the virtues of the system itself. Meanwhile, the radiation spread. The iodine-131, the cesium-137, the strontium-90. These isotopes did not respect borders or hierarchies. They moved through the atmosphere according to the laws of physics, not according to the directives of any government. But the directives continued anyway. The official narratives continued. The silence, even as it became absurd, continued. In Poland, in Scandinavia, in Western Europe, the radiation was detected. The scientists in those countries saw the evidence of a catastrophe that their Soviet counterparts were publicly denying. Here emerged a strange mirror, each side using the evidence to prove that the other side was either lying or incompetent, when in fact, both sides were observing the same truth. The Soviet system was caught between its own logic of control and the inability to control the physics of a radioactive cloud. The international pressure eventually forced an acknowledgement. But even this acknowledgement was managed. The Soviet delegation to the IAEA in Vienna presented a version of events that minimized the severity. The numbers were adjusted downward. The predictions were optimistic. The culpability was distributed among factors: bad timing, unforeseen circumstances, equipment failure. as if the system itself had not designed the conditions in which catastrophe becomes inevitable. Let us pause here, because this is the moment where the mechanism becomes clear. This is not a story about a reactor that failed. This is a story about a system that made the failure of the reactor into a secondary issue. The primary issue for those in power was the management of the story about the reactor. The radiation was one problem, but the loss of control over the narrative was understood as an existential threat to the structure itself. This is what transforms a disaster into a tragedy: the insistence on managing it rather than confronting it. The decision that protecting the system is more important than protecting the people the system was meant to serve. And the mechanisms of power that make this decision seem inevitable, reasonable, the only option available to reasonable people operating within the constraints of their position. The evacuation zone expanded slowly, in stages that lagged behind what the radiation had already accomplished. The official radius was 3 kilometers, then 10, then 30. But by the time each new zone was declared, the damage was already diffused across a much wider area. The lag between knowledge and action was not a technical problem. It was a structural choice. To act more aggressively would have been to admit that the situation was more severe than previously stated. To admit this would have been to undermine the credibility of those who had made the previous statements. And to undermine their credibility would have been to undermine the entire chain of command that led upward to the highest levels of the state. The families who were evacuated, some were told they could return home soon. They were not packed for permanent departure. They left their belongings, their gardens, the small monuments of their lives. In some cases, they were not told the truth about why they were leaving until years later. The system's first instinct in each crisis was not to clarify, but to manage the information in a way that would maximize stability and minimize uncontrollable responses. What happened in the days and weeks after Chernobyl reveals something about how power actually functions in moments of crisis. The people who should have been most invested in transparency, the scientists, the engineers, the technicians, many of them understood the severity of what had occurred. But they also understood the hierarchy in which they operated. Speak the truth too loudly, and you become isolated. Admit the severity, and you implicate everyone above you. The system had built its hierarchy in such a way that honesty became identical to self-destruction. Consider the position of someone in the middle of this structure: a physicist who had reviewed safety assessments before the test, a supervisor who had seen the incomplete maintenance records, an engineer who understood the design flaw. Each of them faced a choice: speak now and sacrifice your career, your security, your standing, or remain silent and preserve the architecture of your life. There is no villain in this scenario. Only a person with a family, a mortgage, a future that depends on institutional stability. The system did not need to threaten such a person. They threatened themselves daily by remaining quiet. Some people did speak. Some internal memos documented the actual severity. But these documents circulated in a limited way, passed from those who needed to know to those above them who also needed to know but could not acknowledge that they knew. The system had created channels for the truth to flow upward, precisely so that plausible deniability could be maintained downward. The top of the hierarchy could claim that certain information had not reached them if it became politically convenient to do so. The story of Chernobyl became the story of a system consuming itself, not in a sudden collapse, but in a slow suffocation under the weight of its own lies. Each official who made a statement that contradicted reality, each decision-maker who prioritized stability over safety, each manager who passed down the implicit order that questions should not be asked. Each of these people understood at some level that they were participating in something destructive, but they also understood that they had no real choice, given the structure within which they operated. This understanding does not excuse anything, but it reveals something crucial: that systems which cannot tolerate truth eventually cannot tolerate reality. They become trapped in a loop where the gap between what is known and what is acknowledged grows larger with each new crisis. The radiation was already spreading when the first official statement was made, but more radiation, in a metaphorical sense, was being distributed through every conversation in which the truth was knowingly withheld or twisted. The official Soviet narrative would eventually settle on this version. There had been an accident. Everything had been handled as well as could be expected. The safety of the reactor had been exaggerated by Western critics, and the heroism of Soviet workers had prevented the situation from becoming catastrophic. This narrative contained elements of all these things, but it transformed a preventable disaster, born of design flaws and systemic negligence, into a misfortune against which heroic measures had been deployed. In the years that followed, documents began to emerge. Internal memos that had circulated during the crisis came to light. Scientists' reports that had been suppressed or minimized. Testimony from workers who had been sent into the contaminated zones without full knowledge of the danger. Each of these documents represented a moment when someone had documented the truth, or at least a piece of it. But the fact that these truths had been documented, and then contained, limited, compartmentalized, told its own story. The archive of Chernobyl is not primarily in the official government records. It is in the gaps between what was said and what was done, in the contradiction between public statements and private memos, in the testimonies of those who knew they were not being told the truth and lived with that knowledge. The radiation left traces in the soil, in the bodies of those exposed, in the mutations that began to appear in subsequent generations. But the information had left traces too, in the strain of maintaining a false narrative, in the damage done to the credibility of institutions that were caught fabricating truth. The workers at Chernobyl who received lethal doses of radiation, they have been mourned, but the narrative around their deaths has been contested. Were they martyrs to a system, or were they casualties of a system that had failed to protect them because it was more concerned with protecting itself? The answer is both, and this bothness is crucial. The system harmed them twice, once through the radiation, once through the insistence on framing that harm as something other than what it was. Consider what it took to maintain the lie. Consider the number of conversations that had to happen in which the truth was implied but not stated. Consider the number of decisions in which people opted for ambiguity rather than clarity, because clarity would have forced them to take stands they couldn't take within the hierarchy. Consider the psychological labor required to participate in the management of a catastrophe while maintaining the narrative that no catastrophe had occurred. This is what we mean by institutional damage. It is not measured only in casualties or contamination. It is measured in the corruption of language itself. When officials speak of accidents rather than crimes, of incidents rather than disasters, of measures taken rather than lives lost, the words themselves become instruments of the system's self-protection. And those who must use these words, or who must listen to them and nod along, begin to lose the ability to articulate what has actually happened. The question that echoes through the decades since Chernobyl is this: did the system fail because of the disaster? Or did the disaster reveal a system that had always been fundamentally unstable, held together only by the discipline of silence and the threat of punishment for those who broke it? The answer becomes visible when we look at what happened to those who spoke. Some were transferred. Some found their careers mysteriously stalled. Some experienced subtle forms of professional isolation. The system did not need to be brutal in its responses. It merely needed to make clear that the cost of truthful speech exceeded the cost of maintaining silence. And once that calculation was clear to everyone, silence became voluntary. People chose it day after day because the architecture of their lives depended on it. Now consider the modern echoes. When institutions discover problems and choose to manage the information rather than the problem itself. When hierarchies suppress inconvenient truths because acknowledging them would require admitting previous statements were wrong. When the focus shifts from addressing the crisis to controlling the narrative about the crisis. When the people in the middle, the scientists, the engineers, the professionals who understand what is actually happening, are trapped between what they know and what they are permitted to say. The files released decades after Chernobyl showed something that many had suspected, but few had been willing to state outright. The Soviet leadership knew, with reasonable accuracy, the scale of the disaster within days. The information existed, it was in the system, but it was sequestered, filtered, shaped, and distributed in ways designed to minimize political damage rather than maximize public safety. What remains of Chernobyl now is not just the exclusion zone, the abandoned cities, the monuments to those who died. What persists most visibly is the question: how many systems are currently doing what the Soviet system did, on a smaller scale or a different time frame? How many institutions are right now choosing the management of narratives over the confrontation with dangerous realities? The radiation that hung over Chernobyl has decayed according to the laws of physics. Iodine-131 halves its presence every 8 days. Cesium-137, 30 years. Strontium-90, 28. This is time that obeys mathematics, that can be calculated. But the lie has no half-life. It continues to generate instability. It continues to undermine the institutions that rely upon it. It continues to ask questions of those who lived within its shadow. In the decades since, former Soviet officials have offered reflections. Some have expressed regret. Some have offered explanations framed as justifications. Some have died, while the question of their own culpability remained technically unresolved because the hierarchies they operated within ensured that responsibility would always be distributed rather than localized. You cannot prosecute a system. You can only dismantle it. And Chernobyl stands as an eternal monument to the cost of keeping a system intact after it has proven itself fundamentally unreliable. What is the moral of this story? Not that we should distrust institutions, though vigilance toward them is warranted. Not that disasters are inevitable, though the conditions that produce them are often concealed within the ordinary functioning of systems we claim to accept. But rather that the moment we become more invested in protecting our own credibility than in acknowledging difficult truths, we begin a process of corruption that expands with every subsequent silence. And that process does not end with the silence. It ends only when the gap between reality and narrative becomes so vast that they no longer intersect, and institutions find themselves guarding a version of events that everyone knows to be false. The men who made the decisions at Chernobyl were not uniquely evil. They operated within a logic that their system had made seem inevitable. They chose stability over honesty because they understood that the alternative, the collapse of the structure that gave them meaning and authority, would cost them everything. But in making that choice, they created the very conditions that would eventually force that collapse anyway. The system preserved itself long enough to guarantee that when it fell, it would fall more catastrophically than if it had been transparent from the beginning. The people of Pripyat are gone. The reactor is enclosed in steel and concrete. The radiation will persist for thousands of years. But what persists most visibly is the question that emerges when we understand how a disaster becomes a disaster, not in the moment of the explosion, but in the cascade of decisions to conceal it. That question is this: what are we willing not to know? What truths are we, right now, choosing not to see? And at what cost?